On the morning of my brother's wedding, I was on my knees scrubbing red wine out of the hallway rug he had spilled on purpose. I'm Lily, 31, and for as long as I can remember, I was the help in my own family's house. My parents treated my brother like royalty. I cleaned his room, I made his meals, and I heard the same sentence my whole life: some people are just meant to serve. That morning, I wore a plain gray dress, picked so I wouldn't outshine the bride. By sundown, the bride's own father would lift a camera, look at my face, and go white as the tablecloth. But what one photograph uncovered that day, and what I did with it, none of them ever saw coming. People hear the help and picture some meek girl with downcast eyes. That was never me. By the time the sun came up that day, I'd already been awake 2 hours. I balanced the farm's books because no one else in that house can hold a column straight. I'd reconciled the feed invoices, paid the propane bill, and changed the dressing on my father Roy's diabetic foot, because I'm a licensed practical nurse and somebody has to be. My mother, Dana, came into the kitchen at 6 and looked at the eggs like they'd insulted her. "These are cold," she said. "They were warm when you slept through your alarm," I answered, and I kept whisking. My brother Grant wouldn't surface until noon, the way he never surfaced before noon a day in his life. I made his plate anyway and set it under a cover, because not making it cost me more grief than making it. Here's the part people never understand. I had a license. I had a paycheck from the county clinic, 15 minutes down Route 9. I had a savings account they didn't know existed. A woman with all that doesn't stay scrubbing somebody else's wine off a rug because she's weak. She stays because something is holding her there, and I hadn't said out loud yet what that something was. Dana watched me work like a foreman watching a hire she didn't trust. "You'll do the flowers and the chairs today," she said. "The wedding's tomorrow, and I won't have you embarrassing this family." I dried my hands. I looked at her. "I never have," I said. And for 1 second, just one, she didn't have an answer. The list Dana handed me that afternoon was 3 pages long. Steam the linens, polish the silver grandma left, the good set. Drive the centerpieces to the Hartley Hall. Press Grant's suit. It read like a contract for a stranger she'd hired, not a chore list for a daughter. I skimmed it once and asked the only question that mattered to me. Am I sitting at a table tomorrow or am I working it? Dana didn't even look up from her coffee. "Honey," she said in that soft voice she used when she wanted a cruelty to sound like wisdom. "Some people are just meant to serve. You've always been so good at it. Don't make it sad." There it was. The sentence I'd been hearing since I was small enough to need a stool to reach the sink. She'd said it when I asked why Grant got summer camp and I got the chicken coop. She'd said it the year I made honor roll and nobody came. She said it now like she was complimenting me. I folded the list in half and slid it into my apron pocket. I didn't argue, because arguing with Dana was like arguing with weather. But I made a note, the way I make notes on a chart, cold and exact, in the part of my mind that never forgets. Tomorrow I would carry trays past my own brother's wedding guests. Tomorrow I would have an apron and no chair. And the day after tomorrow, though none of them knew it yet, I was going to be gone. What I didn't know was that I'd never have to leave the way I'd planned, because someone was about to walk into that hall and recognize my face. Let me clear something up, because I can feel you bracing for a sad girl. I had already gotten out, on paper. 3 weeks before the wedding, I'd signed a lease on a 1-bedroom above the hardware store in town, $800 a month. Mine. I had $11,000 saved in an account at the credit union, built one careful shift at a time over 9 years. There was an application sitting in my email for a full-time floor nurse position at Mercy Regional, the real hospital 2 counties over, better pay, and a pension. The only reason I was still under Dana's roof was a reason I hadn't told anyone, and I'll get to it. But weak? No. The night before, Grant had banged on my door at midnight holding his wedding shirt. "Iron this," he said, already turning away, certain. I held the door half open. "Iron it yourself or wear it wrinkled," I said. "I'm off the clock." He blinked at me like the dog had spoken. "Mom," he called down the hall. the way he'd called for her his whole life when the world didn't bend. Dana's voice floated up. Lily, don't start. I shut my door, soft, and turned the lock. Through the wood, I heard Grant mutter the thing he always muttered. She thinks she's somebody. The thing is, I did think I was somebody. I'd thought it for years, quietly, while I balanced their books and bandaged their wounds and kept their secrets fed and warm. They just hadn't noticed yet that the help had been keeping records. And a woman who keeps records is never as powerless as the people counting on her silence believe. Grant brought Brooke by the house that evening to drop off the seating chart. My brother had a way of walking into a room like it had been built for him, because as far as he knew, it had. Lil, grab us some sweet tea, he said, not looking at me, steering Brooke toward the good couch. She's basically staff, he told his fiancée, grinning like it was a charming family joke. That's literally her job. Brooke didn't laugh. I watched her not laugh, and I filed it away. She was tall and easy in her own skin, the kind of woman who says thank you to waiters and means it. When I brought the tea, she took her glass with both hands and looked right at me. I'm sorry, I don't think I caught your name, she said. Grant answered for me. That's just Lily. Brooke kept her eyes on me, waiting, so I gave her the rest of it myself. Lily Whitfield, I said. She tilted her head, the smallest motion, like a word was sitting on the tip of her tongue and wouldn't come. Whitfield, she repeated. Have we met? You look so familiar to me. I swear I've seen your face somewhere. I told her I had one of those faces and went to refill the pitcher. But behind me, I heard Dana's chair scrape, fast, and her voice come out too bright. Brooke, sweetheart, let me show you the garden before the light goes. She steered Brooke out the back door by the elbow, quick, like she was getting her away from a hot stove. I stood at the sink with the pitcher running over. I didn't know yet why my mother was afraid of a stranger looking too long at my face, but I was about to start finding out. It nagged at me the rest of the night, the way a wrong number on a chart nags until you fix it. Brooke had looked at me like she was reading a name she almost knew. People say, "You look familiar," all the time. They don't usually mean it the way she meant it. Slow and certain, like my face matched a photograph she'd grown up staring at, and Dana's reaction was the louder tell. My mother did not do anything quickly except when she was scared. I'd seen her stand calm through a barn fire and a foreclosure notice, but let a guest look too long at me, and she moved like the kitchen was filling with smoke. Later, drying glasses, I asked her plainly, "Where did Brooke's family grow up?" Dana stiffened over the sink. "Why would that matter to you?" "Just making conversation," I said. "You don't make conversation," she snapped. "You make work." Then, softer, the way she pivoted when she'd shown too much. "Her people are from over by Cedar Hollow, I think. Old family. Now finish those and go to bed. You've got a long day." Cedar Hollow. The county hospital where I was born sat in Cedar Hollow. I set the last glass in the rack and watched my mother's hands. They were trembling, just barely, the way a leaf does before you feel the wind. Dana Whitfield was not a woman who trembled. Whatever Brooke's family carried, my mother had spent 30 years praying it would never sit down at her table. And tomorrow it was coming to her son's wedding, dressed in its Sunday best, carrying a camera. I told you there was one reason I'd stayed, and her name was Nana Ruth. Roy's mother lived with us my whole childhood, in the front room with the good light, and she was the only person in that house who ever called me something tender. "My girl," she'd say, patting the cushion. "Come sit by me, my girl." When Dana made me eat in the kitchen, Ruth carried her own plate in and ate beside me at the counter. Slow, so I wouldn't eat alone. She taught me cards. She taught me that a person's worth isn't up for a vote. 7 months before the wedding, she was dying in a hospice bed we'd set up in that same front room, and I worked every double I could swing so I could nurse her myself at night. I'd promised her I'd see her out. That was the reason. That was the whole reason. Near the end, lucid for a moment in the dark, she gripped my wrist with surprising strength. "Lily," she said, "there's something I should have told you years ago. Something about how you came to us." I leaned close. Tell me, Nana. But her eyes had already drifted, and the morphine pulled her back under, and 3 days later, she was gone, with the sentence unfinished between us. I almost stopped telling this story right here, because the next part still makes my hands shake. If you've ever stayed somewhere too long for the sake of someone you loved, you already understand me. Stay with me now. What Nana Ruth left behind in an old tin box is about to change everything. Comment, "I'm here, so I know you are," and keep watching. After Ruth's funeral, I'd packed most of her things into the attic, all but one box I couldn't make myself open. That night, with the wedding bearing down and my mother trembling at sinks, I climbed up and got it. It was a flat tin that used to hold shortbread, light as a secret. I made my plan first, the way I always do. I'd go to the wedding tomorrow. I'd work it, because refusing would only feed the fire, and I was done feeding fires. Monday, I'd hand in my notice on the farm, move my boxes to the apartment over the hardware store, and start at Mercy Regional in 2 weeks. A clean exit, no drama, the help simply gone one morning like frost off a field. I sat on my bed and pried the tin open. On top were Ruth's church bulletins and a pressed flower gone to paper. Under that, a baby's hospital bracelet, the kind they snap on a newborn's wrist, the plastic yellowed, the ink faded soft. I picked it up. It was so small it would have fit around my 2 fingers. My own name should have been on it. I held it under the lamp and tried to read what was printed there, and my heart started doing something slow and strange in my chest. Because the numbers on that bracelet, the ones I could still make out, did not match the birth certificate Dana kept in the fireproof box downstairs. I'd seen that certificate 100 times. I knew those numbers cold. And these were different. 2 different sets of numbers, for one baby girl, born one night in Cedar Hollow. I sat there a long time, holding the proof that I had no idea yet how to read. The rehearsal dinner was at the Hartley Hall, a big timber room with string lights and a long table that sat 40. I wasn't a guest at it. I was the one refilling the water pitchers and clearing the salad plates while my family toasted my brother. I'd tucked the tin bracelet into my coat pocket before I left, because I couldn't stand to leave it in that house. I moved around the edges of the room the way I always did, quiet, useful, invisible. Except I didn't feel invisible that night. I felt like I was carrying a lit match in my coat. Grant stood to make a toast halfway through, glass up, already a little drunk on champagne and attention. "To family," he said, "and to the people who make a day like this run." He found me over by the drinks table and lifted his glass an inch in my direction, grinning for the crowd. "Some people are just meant to serve, right, Lil? And nobody serves like my sister." The table laughed, warm and easy, the way a room laughs when it doesn't know it's watching cruelty. I just looked at him and didn't smile. But Brooke didn't laugh that time either, and down at the head of the table, an older man I hadn't met yet had stopped laughing too. He was watching me the way you watch a word you can't place, his fork halfway to his plate, his brow drawn down. Silver hair, good coat, the stillness of a man used to being listened to. I didn't know his name yet. I didn't know that he was about to change the entire shape of my life. I just knew that of everyone in that loud, bright room, he was the only one really looking at me. He found me by the kitchen door near the end of the night, while I was stacking dessert plates. "Excuse me," he said, gentle, the way you'd approach a skittish horse. "I don't mean to bother you. I'm Raymond, Brooke's father." I told him it was no bother and kept my hands moving. He didn't leave. He stood there a moment, and when I looked up, his eyes were doing something complicated, soft and stricken at once. "Forgive an old man's rudeness," he said. "But might I ask your name? Your full name? And where you were born?" It was a strange question from the father of the bride at a rehearsal dinner, but there was nothing strange in how he asked it. It was the most careful anyone had spoken to me in years. "Lily Whitfield," I said. "Born right here in Cedar Hollow." Something moved across his face like a cloud crossing a field. He opened his mouth, and before a single word could come out, Dana was there, between us. her hand light on Raymond's arm and her smile screwed on tight. "Mr. Hartley, you don't want to keep the help from her work," she said, bright and brittle. "Lily, the cars need loading." She steered me toward the kitchen with a grip that left marks. But I looked back once, over my shoulder, and Raymond Hartley was still standing exactly where I'd left him, staring after me like a man who'd just seen someone walk out of a grave. Whatever he'd seen in my face, my mother had spent 30 years making sure he never would. That night, I couldn't sleep, so I did what I always do when something won't add up. I went looking for the numbers. The house was dark and quiet, Dana and Roy asleep, Grant gone back to his place in town. I took the fireproof box from the hall closet, the one Dana thinks I don't have the second key to, and I laid my birth certificate on the kitchen table next to Nana Ruth's little yellowed bracelet. Then I held my phone light over both and read them. Slow, side by side, the way I read two charts when a dose looks wrong. The date matched. October 4th, the same on both. But the medical record number printed on the bracelet was not the number typed on the certificate. Not one digit off, the way a typo runs. Completely different. And the birth weight stamped on the bracelet read 6 pounds, 1 ounce. The certificate said 5 pounds, 9. A baby is one weight when she's born. 1. I sat very still in that dark kitchen with two documents that swore they belonged to the same little girl and couldn't both be telling the truth. On the inside of the bracelet, almost rubbed away, was the start of a printed last name. Not Whitfield. The first letters were soft and broken under 31 years of handling, but the shape of them was wrong for my name, and I traced them with my thumb again and again, trying to make them say something they wouldn't. I photographed both papers and the bracelet front and back before I put anything away. Whatever was happening here, I was going to have a record of it. I'd learned a long time ago that in this family, the truth survives only if you keep a copy. I'm not a woman who sits on a question. The next morning, the morning of the wedding, I put the bracelet flat on the kitchen table in front of Dana and asked her straight. "Why doesn't this match my birth certificate?" My mother looked down at it, and I watched the color leave her face in real time, the way it drains from a patient who's about to go down. For 1 second, she was somewhere far away and frightened. Then she snatched it up and closed her fist around it. "Where did you get this?" she said, low and hard. "Nana Ruth left it to me," I said. "Whose is it, Dana?" "It's junk," she said. "Your grandmother was half out of her mind at the end, you know that. She kept all kinds of garbage, old hospital trash." She shoved the bracelet into her apron pocket out of my reach. "You will not bring this up again, do you hear me? Not today. Not ever." Behind her, Roy had stopped in the kitchen doorway with his coffee. He looked at the table where the bracelet had been, and then at me, and his mouth opened like he had something to say. My father is not a brave man. He stood there a long moment with the words behind his teeth, and then he set his cup down and walked out to the truck without a sound. But here's what Dana didn't understand. You don't snatch up junk and lock it in your pocket. You don't go white over garbage. Her panic told me everything her mouth wouldn't. That bracelet was not trash. It was a fuse. And my mother had just confirmed, with her own shaking hands, that it led somewhere she would do anything to keep me from looking. Good thing I'd already photographed it. While Dana was upstairs getting Grant's boutonniere pinned, I stepped out onto the porch and made 2 phone calls, calm as a Tuesday. First, I called Cedar Hollow County Hospital's medical records line. I told them I needed a certified copy of my own birth record, the full file, and I gave them my date of birth and my social. The clerk said requests like that take 3 to 5 business days and need a signature. I said fine and gave her my work email at the clinic, the one Dana couldn't reach. Then I called a private lab I knew through the clinic, the kind that does paternity and ancestry work, and I asked what a DNA comparison would take. 2 to 3 weeks for a result that would hold up legally, the woman said, once they had 2 samples and signed consent. I wrote the intake number on the back of my hand in pen. I was a nurse. I knew exactly how this worked, what a cheek swab proves and what it doesn't, how chain of custody keeps a result from being thrown out later, and that real answers come back in weeks, not minutes. I didn't have anyone to compare myself to yet, but I had a feeling that was about to change, because a man with silver hair had looked at my face last night like he already knew the answer. I slid my phone in my pocket and went back inside to put on my plain gray dress. My mother thought she'd shut the door on this. She had no idea I'd already started prying it back open, one careful, documented step at a time. The wedding was in 4 hours. By the time it was over, I'd have more than a feeling. Before I left for the hall, I went back to the tin box one more time. I'd been so shaken by the bracelet that I hadn't emptied it all the way. Now I lifted out the church bulletins and the pressed flower and ran my fingers along the bottom, and I felt it. A seam, a piece of paper tucked under the liner where the tin met its base. I worked it loose. It was a single sheet, folded in quarters, soft as cloth from age, and on it was Nana Ruth's handwriting, that careful schoolteacher cursive I'd know anywhere. I read it standing by the window in the morning light. "My girl," it said, "ask them about the night you came home. You were loved before you ever got here, and don't you let them tell you different. The truth belongs to you. I'm sorry I was too much a coward to give it sooner. Forgive me. Love always, Nana." Folded inside the note was a square of newspaper, brittle and yellow, an obituary clipped long ago. I unfolded it with shaking fingers. Helen Hartley, it read, beloved wife and mother, died in childbirth at Cedar Hollow County Hospital, survived by her husband Raymond and their daughter, 31 years ago. The same month I was born, the same hospital. Hartley. The broken letters on the inside of my bracelet swam up in my memory, and now they wanted to spell something. I sat down on the edge of the bed because my legs had stopped agreeing to hold me. Ask them about the night you came home. I'd carried that bracelet for 7 months without knowing what it was. Now I had a name to set beside it, and a date, and an old man at my brother's wedding who shared that name, and had looked at me like I was a ghost. I folded everything back up and put it in my purse. I was taking the truth to the wedding myself. In the truck outside the hall, before I went in, I sat with my phone and did the work. Because feelings aren't proof, and I needed to know what I actually had. I searched Helen Hartley, Cedar Hollow, and the obituary came up archived in the county paper. Word for word, the clipping in my purse. Died in childbirth. Survived by her husband Raymond and their daughter. I pulled up everything I could find on the Hartley family. There was Raymond, the silver-haired man from last night, a name on the boards of a couple of farm co-ops. Respected. Quiet. And there was a daughter, Brooke, the bride my brother was marrying in 2 hours. I set the phone in my lap and made myself breathe. Brooke had looked at me and said I was familiar, like a face from an old photograph. Of course I was. If a girl had been born to Helen Hartley the night Helen died, and if that girl had somehow ended up across the county in the Whitfield house, then the bride and I might be looking at the same face every time we looked at each other, the same mother's face. I didn't let myself finish the thought all the way, because it was too big and the parking lot was filling up. But I knew one thing for certain now. Raymond Hartley had buried a wife 31 years ago and been told her baby was lost, and in a few minutes I was going to walk into his daughter's wedding carrying a bracelet, an obituary, and a face he clearly recognized. I checked my reflection in the visor mirror. Helen's daughter, maybe, looked back at me. Then I got out of the truck and went in to work the wedding, because I needed to see his eyes when he saw mine in the daylight. Dana caught me in the hall's side pantry while I was tying my apron on over the gray dress. She'd found out about the phone calls somehow, maybe the records clerk, maybe just the animal sense a guilty person has for being investigated. She backed me against the shelving and kept her voice down so the early guests wouldn't hear. "I know you called the hospital," she hissed. "What is wrong with you? Today, of all days?" "I asked for my own records," I said. "That's my right." "You're right." She laughed, ugly and quiet. "Let me tell you about your rights. You make one scene at this wedding, you breathe one word of your sick little story, and you are out. Tonight. No room, no recommendation, not $1. You'll have nothing, because you are nothing without this family." I looked at my mother, this woman who'd worked me like a hired hand for 23 years, and I felt the last thread of fear for her go slack in my chest. I already signed a lease, Dana, I said. 3 weeks ago. I start at Mercy Regional in a fortnight. You can't put me out of anywhere because I was already leaving. She stared at me, and for the first time in my life, I watched my mother realize she had no hold on me left to pull. Here's where people always ask me why I didn't just walk out of that pantry and keep walking. The truth? I needed to look one man in the eye first. I needed to know whose daughter I was before I let this family decide it for me one more time. If you've ever needed the truth more than you needed peace, you understand me completely. Subscribe and stay close, because the wedding is where every buried thing comes up for air. The ceremony itself was lovely, and I watched it from the back with a tray of champagne balanced on my arm. Brooke was a beautiful bride. Grant cried, which surprised me, until I realized he was crying at how good he looked doing it. When the wedding party moved into the hall for the reception, the work started in earnest, and so did Grant. He'd had 2 glasses by then, and he was loose and mean with it. As I crossed the floor with a full tray, he stuck his foot out, just an inch, just enough, and caught my ankle so the tray tipped and red wine went down the front of a folding chair and onto the hardwood. "Whoops," he said, loud for the people near him. "Better clean that up before somebody slips, Lil. Wouldn't want a lawsuit at my wedding." A few people chuckled. I went down on one knee with a bar towel, the same way I'd started this whole day. Scrubbing wine my brother spilled on purpose, but it felt different now. It felt like the last time. I wiped the floor slow and even, and while I was down there, eye level with everyone's good shoes, I made myself a promise. This was the final thing I would ever clean for this family. I stood up, set the towel on the tray, and that's when I saw Raymond Hartley across the room, already watching me, already half out of his chair. The reckoning I'd driven here to find was about to walk straight across the dance floor and meet me. He didn't cross the room, not yet. He just stood there at his table with his napkin slipping off his knee, staring at me like the floor had opened. I straightened my apron and made myself keep moving, because 100 wedding guests don't know they're watching the start of an earthquake. But I tracked him from the corner of my eye the whole time. When I came near his table to clear a plate, he spoke, barely above a whisper, and the word he said wasn't to me. It was to a ghost. "Helen?" My hand stopped over the plate. I looked at him. Up close in the daylight pouring through the tall windows, his eyes were wet, and his face had gone the gray of old ash. "I'm sorry," he said, catching himself. "I'm so sorry. You just, for a moment, you looked exactly like someone I lost a long time ago." "Helen Hartley," I said quietly, watching his face. He flinched like I'd touched a wound. "How do you know that name?" Before I could answer, Dana materialized out of nowhere, the way she'd been doing all weekend, and laid her hand on his shoulder. "Raymond, come, they're about to cut the cake," she said, too loud, steering, always steering. But this time, Raymond didn't move. He looked up at my mother's hand on his shoulder, and then back at my face, and something in him went very still and very certain. He wasn't a man you could hurt anymore. He'd seen his dead wife pouring champagne at his daughter's wedding, and he was not going to be moved along. The photographer called for the big group picture not long after. The whole blended family crowded onto the risers by the windows. Dana arranged everyone like she arranged everything. Grant and Brooke at the center, the Whitfields close, the Hartleys to the side. She put me at the very end of the back row, half cut off by the frame, the way you'd include a piece of furniture you couldn't move out in time. "Smile," the photographer said, and the bulb flashed. Then Raymond, who'd been asked to take a few on his own camera too, lifted his to his eye and pressed the shutter once. And he froze. He lowered the camera and stared at the little screen on the back, not moving, while the group around him started to break apart and drift toward the cake. He looked at the screen. He looked up at me, at the end of the row. He looked back at the screen. Then he reached into his coat with a hand that shook and drew out his wallet, and from behind the cards he slid a photograph so worn it was nearly white at the folds. He held it up next to me, his eyes going back and forth. The screen, the picture, my face. I couldn't see the old photo from where I stood. I didn't need to. I could read the answer in what was happening to his face, which was the look of a man watching 31 years of grief rearrange itself into something he didn't have a word for yet. "Oh my God," he said, very soft. "Oh my God, it's you." He stepped down off the riser toward me, holding the old photograph out so I could finally see it. It was a young woman in a yellow dress, laughing on a porch, and except for the dress and the years, it was my face. My exact face. "This is my wife," Raymond said. "This is Helen. The spring before we lost her. And the baby." His voice broke and he had to start again. "They told us the baby didn't make it. They told us she was gone. That same night. And in all the grief we never even, there was no." He couldn't finish. He pulled out his phone instead and called someone, right there on the dance floor, his back half turned, his voice low and urgent. I caught pieces of it. An old friend, a doctor who'd worked at Cedar Hollow County back then. "I need to ask you about a night 31 years ago," Raymond said into the phone. "Helen Hartley's delivery. I need to know what really happened to that baby." While he talked, I stood very still with the tin bracelet in my pocket and the obituary in my purse, and I understood that the proof had been gathering around me for days. The records I'd requested, the 2 sets of numbers, Helen's face, which was my face, in a photograph worn soft in his wallet. And now a man who'd buried a daughter 31 years ago, on the phone with someone who'd been inside that hospital the night she was supposedly lost. I didn't have a DNA result, and I knew I wouldn't for weeks. But I didn't need a lab to tell me what every person in that hall could already see when they looked from Raymond's photograph to my face. All it would take now was for someone to finally say it out loud. I didn't wait to be rescued. I've never once in my life been rescued, and I wasn't going to start by standing around hoping the adults would sort it out. When Raymond lowered the phone, his eyes streaming, I walked straight up to him, and I laid it all on the nearest table, clean and plain, the way I'd lay out instruments before a procedure. The baby bracelet, the obituary clipped from the county paper, Nana Ruth's note in her schoolteacher cursive. "My name is Lily," I told him. "I was born at Cedar Hollow County the same night your wife died there. My birth records don't match my own bracelet. I'm a nurse. I've already requested those hospital records, and I've ordered a DNA test. If you'll give a sample and sign the consent, it will prove what we're both already looking at. It takes a few weeks to come back. Witnessed and legal, so no one can ever call it staged." Raymond looked at the little pile of paper, his whole life turning over on a wedding table, and then he looked at me with something I hadn't been handed in 23 years. Respect. "Yes," he said. "God, yes. Whatever you need. But I don't need a test to know that face." Brooke had come up behind her father somewhere in the middle of it, her veil pushed back, and she'd heard all of it. She looked at the bracelet, and at the old photo of Helen still in Raymond's hand, and at me, and I watched my brother's bride do the math that the rest of them were still refusing to do. She reached out and took my hand. I knew your face," she whispered. "I've been looking at it my whole life." That was when Dana lost the room, and knew it. She came at us fast, her wedding smile gone to something cornered and wild. "Stop this," she said, loud enough now that heads turned all over the hall. "Stop it right now. She's lying. She's been a liar her whole life, jealous of her brother, and she will say anything to ruin his day. Raymond, I am so sorry. She's not well." She grabbed for the bracelet on the table. I put my hand over it first. The guests had gone quiet, drinks halfway to mouths, the band trailing off. Roy stood at the edge of it all, ashen, looking at the baby bracelet on the table like it was a live coal. His lips moved. For 1 second I thought my father was finally going to say the true thing. He looked at me, and his eyes were wet, and he opened his mouth, and then Dana said his name, sharp. "Roy." And he closed it again and looked at the floor. 23 years. And even now he couldn't. Dana drew herself up and threw the old sentence at me one last time, in front of everyone, like it had always been a weapon, and we'd both just been pretending it was wisdom. You are the help, she said, shaking. Do you hear me? You always have been. Some people are just meant to serve, and that is all you will ever be. The room flinched, and in the center of it I felt myself go very calm, the way I go calm when a patient is crashing and everyone else is starting to panic. Raymond's phone rang while Dana's words were still hanging in the air. The doctor, calling back. I watched Raymond listen, one hand pressed over his mouth, nodding, his eyes closing. When he lowered the phone, his voice came out rough. He remembers that night, Raymond said, to no one and everyone. He says there was a stillbirth and a mix-up in the nursery, confusion he was never easy about, and that the sealed records will show it. He'll swear to it. He pressed his hand flat to his chest. He thinks my daughter never died at all. He thinks she went home with the wrong family. Thinks. Not knows. Not yet. Not on the word of one old man's memory down a phone line. The certainty would come later in unsealed records and a lab result no one could wave away. But standing in that hall, I had a bracelet, an obituary, a dead woman's face on mine, and a doctor ready to testify. I could have whispered all of it to Raymond and slipped out the side door and let the lawyers handle it Monday. No scene, no fuss. That would have been the old Lily, the one who kept everything inside where it was safe. But I'd spent 23 years being told my place was at the edge of the frame, working the room I wasn't allowed to sit in. Not today. I picked up a spoon and tapped it twice against a water glass, the clear, bright sound a person makes before a toast. The hall went silent. 100 faces turned to the woman in the apron, and for the first time in my life, every single one of them was waiting to hear what I would say. I set the glass down and I spoke quietly, because I'd learned long ago that a calm voice in a loud room is the one people lean in to hear. My name is Lily, I said. Most of you know me as the help. For 23 years I cleaned this family's house, cooked their meals, and balanced their books for free. I was told I was born to serve. I let that sit. Nobody moved. This week my grandmother's things came down from the attic, and in them I found a baby's hospital bracelet that does not match my birth certificate. 2 different record numbers, 2 different weights, for one baby girl, born one night in Cedar Hollow. I held up Nana Ruth's note so the light caught it. She left me this. It says, "Ask them about the night you came home." So I did. I turned the note toward Raymond and toward Brooke beside him. Tonight, Helen Hartley's husband told me his baby daughter was declared dead at that same hospital, the same night I was born there. She wasn't dead. She was handed to the wrong family by mistake, and that family chose never to fix it. My voice never rose. I didn't need it to. I've requested the sealed hospital records and a DNA test that will make this a matter of law within weeks. But Mr. Hartley's own doctor remembers that night, and you only have to look from his wife's photograph to my face to know already what the paperwork will say. I let them look, all of them, from the picture in Raymond's hand to the woman in the apron. I am not the help. I am Helen Hartley's daughter, and I have been her daughter the whole time. For a second the hall was so quiet I could hear the string lights humming. Then it broke open all at once. Raymond came toward me with both hands out, tears running freely down a proud man's face, saying my mother's name and mine in the same breath. Helen, you're Helen's girl. You're mine. Brooke was crying and laughing at the same time, her veil crooked, gripping my arm like she'd float off without it, saying sister over and over, trying the word out. Because that was the other half of it, the part that landed on the whole room at once. If I was Helen and Raymond's lost daughter, then Brooke, the bride, the woman my brother had just married, was my blood sister. We'd grown up 20 miles apart wearing the same dead mother's face, and we'd finally been put in the same room because Grant happened to fall for the girl who should have been raised beside me. The guests were on their feet now, a rising tide of voices, some gasping, some already turning hard eyes toward Dana. Grant stood frozen at the center of his own wedding in his beautiful suit, looking from me to Brooke to his mother, his mouth working, no charm left to reach for. For the first time in his entire pampered life, my brother was not the most important person in the room. He wasn't even in the top 5, and he had absolutely no idea what to do with that. It was Roy who broke first. My father, who hadn't managed a true word in 23 years, put his face in his hands and said it into the silence, hoarse and ruined. "It's true." The whole hall heard him. "God forgive me, it's true. We knew. We always knew." And that was what took the floor out from under Dana, because the one man who'd helped her hold the lie for 3 decades had just let go of his end of it in front of everyone. She rounded on him, then on me, and she came apart in front of all the people she'd spent her life performing for. "You don't know what it was like," she screamed, ragged and high, nothing left of the soft poison she usually spoke in. She grabbed the edge of a table and a stack of plates went down and shattered, and she didn't even flinch. "I lost my baby that night. She came too early and she died in my arms in that hallway, and they put another baby in the bassinet. And I was supposed to just hand her back? I'd already lost one." Her face twisted, wet, past any stopping now. "I gave you a roof. I fed you. You owed me those years." She'd come into that hall meaning to deny everything. Cornered instead. With her husband's confession still ringing off the walls, she'd admitted all of it. The guests stared at the woman who'd just told 100 witnesses she'd known all along and had raised a motherless child as a servant rather than face it. I didn't scream back. I didn't have to. She was doing all my work for me, the way she'd made me do all hers for years. I waited until she ran out of breath. Then I walked over to her, close, so I wouldn't have to raise my voice, and I said the thing I'd been carrying up out of that dark kitchen for a week. "You were right, Dana." She stared at me, chest heaving. "All those years, you were right about one thing. Some people are just meant to serve." The room held its breath. "I serve the truth," I said. "Not you. Never you again." I reached into my apron pocket and took out the ring of keys I'd carried since I was 12 years old. The house, the barn, the feed shed, the back door I'd let myself in and out of 10,000 times as the help. I set them down on the table beside the broken plates. Quiet. Final. A small bright sound in a silent room. "I came home 31 years ago to the wrong house," I said. "I'm not staying in it one more night." Dana's mouth opened and nothing came out. Whatever she'd built her grief and her cruelty on for 3 decades, it had just collapsed in front of the only audience she'd ever truly cared about. And she finally understood that no version of the story could put it back. I turned away from her. Behind me, I heard her start to say my name. Lily. Small now, almost pleading, the voice of a woman reaching for a leash that wasn't in her hand anymore. I didn't turn around. That was the last thing she ever got to make me do, which was nothing at all. The reception didn't recover, and nobody pretended it should. Guests gathered in low, stunned clusters, and more than one of Dana's church friends came up to me. Not to her, to take my hand and say they were sorry. They'd had no idea. That little girl in the apron all these years. Raymond moved through it like a man walking in a dream he was afraid to wake from, keeping one hand on my shoulder as if I might vanish if he let go. He started doing the thing I'd never once experienced at a Whitfield gathering. He introduced me. "This is my daughter," he said, to an aunt, to a cousin, to the silver-haired men he knew from the co-op boards. "This is Lily, my daughter." Each time he said it, something in my chest that had been clenched for 31 years let go another notch. Grant tried once to get near Brooke, to salvage some piece of the day, and I heard her tell him quietly that they would talk tomorrow, that right now she needed to be with her sister. He didn't argue. He'd lost the only language he had, the language of being wanted most, and standing there in his wedding suit he looked, for the first time, like exactly what he was. A grown man who had never once been told no, finding out all at once that the world had not, in fact, been built for him. The risers by the window were empty now. There was no one left to arrange me into the corner of the frame. I could have stayed and watched Dana sink, and part of me wanted to. But I've cleaned up enough wreckage in my life, and I wasn't going to spend my first free night doing it for her one more time. I hugged Brooke and promised her coffee Sunday. The two of us. Just sisters. No veils and no wedding to work. I let Raymond hold both my hands a long moment and tell me he'd be calling, that there was so much to say, that I had a whole family on the other side of the county who'd grieved a baby and would weep to know she was grown and standing in front of them. Then I untied my apron. I folded it once, set it on the chair I'd never been allowed to sit in, and I walked out of that hall under my own power, past my mother, past my brother, past 23 years, and nobody told me where to go or what to carry. The June evening was warm and the gravel lot smelled like cut hay. I got in my truck, the one I'd paid for myself, and I sat there a second with my hands on the wheel, free. Then I drove the 15 minutes to the little apartment over the hardware store that was already, quietly, mine. For the first time in my life, I went home to a house where no one was waiting to be served. The weeks after were paperwork, the good kind, the kind that builds a life instead of propping up a lie. The county reopened the old hospital records once Raymond's lawyer and mine filed together, and the investigation into that night 31 years ago is ongoing, with the surviving staff being questioned about what they knew and when. The DNA test I'd ordered came back 3 weeks later and said in cold percentages what the whole reception had already seen with their own eyes. Raymond Hartley is my father. My birth certificate is being legally corrected, Hartley where it always should have read. Dana is facing the consequences of what she said in front of 100 witnesses, and there are lawyers for that too, because keeping a child you knew wasn't yours, and falsifying her records is not a thing the law simply forgives, because 3 decades passed. I didn't have to manufacture any of it. The truth did the work. I started at Mercy Regional that month, full-time, floor nursing, the pension and the better pay, and a name badge that finally has the right last name coming. The apartment over the hardware store turned out to get beautiful evening light. And on Sundays I drive out to the Hartley farm, where Raymond keeps Helen's photograph on the mantel, the woman in the yellow dress with my face, and where Brooke and I sit on the porch and trade the childhoods we should have shared. I learned more about my mother in a month of those porch afternoons than I'd known in my whole life. Her laugh, her stubbornness, where I got my hands. Roy called me about a month in. I almost didn't pick up, but I did. Because I'm done being afraid of that house, and you can't be done with something you won't even look at. He asked to meet, and I gave him 1 hour at a diner on neutral ground, my choosing. He cried into his coffee and told me he'd known for years that he'd been a coward, that he was sorry. I let him say all of it. Then I told him the truth, which is that sorry 31 years late doesn't undo a single morning I spent on my knees, but that I wasn't going to carry his guilt for him either, because I'd carried enough of that family's weight already. I wouldn't be coming back to be anyone's help. I'd keep in touch, on my terms, at the distance I chose, and not an inch closer than felt right. He nodded like a man who knew he'd been handed more grace than he'd earned. Grant texted me a half apology a week later, the kind that's really about making himself feel better. I read it. I didn't answer. Some doors you get to leave shut, and that's not cruelty. That's just a clean boundary, finally drawn. I spent 23 years being told my worth was the work of my hands, and it turned out the people who said it the loudest were the ones most afraid of what my own face could prove. That's how a wedding photograph gave me back my name, a scrubbed rug, a baby bracelet that didn't match, a father who froze at the sight of my face. If anyone has ever told you that you were just the help, remember whose fear that really is, and remember that the truth keeps your name safe even when the people raising you won't. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Tell me your own story in the comments, and subscribe.